In this episode, we sit down with Jason Bahl and getting graphical with WordPress. Jason is the creator and maintainer of WP GraphQL. We get to talk all about GraphQL and how we can use WordPress as a headless CMS. Check it out. Welcome back, peeps, to Perfect.dev, where we give you cats the freshest dose of dev snacks. Now with your amazing hosts, Alex Patterson and Brittany Postma. This episode is sponsored by Builder.io. Visually build on your tech stack. Jason Bahl, what up, Jason?
Welcome.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, thanks for having me.
I almost stumbled on our title with the whole GraphiQL. That was pretty clever.
Graphical.
Graphical. Yeah. So Jason is the creator and maintainer of WP GraphQL, which is a WordPress plugin that allows for a headless WordPress REST endpoint of GraphQL. Is that a terrible way to say it? I hope not. So I'm going to let Jason talk all about it. Jason, can you tell us just a little bit of your background, how you kind of got into the WordPress world and have and wanted to create this plugin for it?
Yeah, sure. I've been doing WordPress development for, 13 or so years now. So yeah, I've been very familiar with WordPress and how folks use it. And then I was working for a newspaper organization. We had 100 and something newspapers across the U.S. and we did a lot of content syndication. So when one newspaper, for example, I'm in Denver, as you might have noticed, when the Denver Post, for example, that was one of our newspapers, when they published an article, Denver Broncos win the Super Bowl, that might need to get published on multiple newspapers across the country that we also run. And instead of having somebody log into each one and, publish it, we would automate that, right? So data would move from one site to another site. So we were moving a lot of data. We were using the WordPress REST API to do a lot of this movement of data to communicate over the network with each other. And that was, as we scaled, we were on WordPress for these newspaper sites. We started with one newspaper on WordPress, then 2, then 3, and then 54 were on WordPress. And as we scaled that process of syndicating data, it became problematic for us. One, the actual network responses were problematic because when you're dealing with a RESTful API, each resource is a different endpoint. So, and when you're syndicating, think of a newspaper article. When you're syndicating a newspaper article, there's the actual article itself, but then there's the author that wrote it. There's the categories and the tags that are associated with it. All of those are different entities. Then you have images that are associated with it. So to syndicate one article, you're actually moving a lot of resources to get the job done. And so the two problems, there was actual network performance issues that were causing us issues, especially when you had to do it to 54 sites or, any subset of that amount. So that was causing us problems.
Is that across the wide area network or internet or what were you actually sending that over?
Yeah, we were using HTTP. So it was just websites talking to websites.
Okay.
And the websites were operated independently. Like we had access to them, but some newspapers would get acquired and we'd have to divest it. And it had to largely operate independently. So they weren't one cohesive thing. But anyway, yeah, so we were sending this data, caused actual network problems, but more than that, it caused developer performance problems, I would call it. Because when something went wrong, right, it was very difficult to figure out where the thing that went wrong. And part of that is RESTful APIs are implicit, where you have an endpoint and you get whatever the server tells you you're going to get. You as the developer have limited control over what the endpoint is going to give you. And so that was often problematic. Something on the server would change. We weren't prepared for that change. Something broke. It was difficult to figure out what, why, who, what, when, So it caused us a lot of headaches. And And so we were kind of rethinking like, okay, how can we make our jobs easier? And GraphQL was open source in 2015 by Facebook. I did some research into it and I said, hey, this might solve. I was less concerned about the network issue problems. Like we had solutions we could have done to fix some of those things. I was more concerned about our developer workflows. And so this GraphQL thing looked interesting where you can do multiple resources in individual requests. So I started looking into this technology and prototyped it at home and then showed some of my coworkers. Took a little while to get some buy-in, but finally, I was able to say, hey, I think we can actually solve some of our issues with this. So got buy-in from coworkers. We started working on revamping our syndication, which is not like the first thought people have when they think of GraphQL. But we started revamping that platform to use GraphQL, specifically mutations, which is actually writing data instead of querying data. And so part of it gave us like better guarantees on the validation we were doing, just a better way to structure our code too, easier to look at a GraphQL query and mutation and see what the intent was when whoever wrote the code wrote it. Because we could say, oh, they wanted these exact fields. So if that ever breaks, we at least knew what they were trying to do at that time. Where with REST, you'd look at an endpoint and you're like, crud, I don't really know what that person was trying to do with that endpoint. So you got to spend a lot of time digging through and figure out what they were trying to do, where GraphQL is very explicit. So so we got to work in with the newspaper. I continued working on it just as open source project on my own time, knowing that content syndication was probably not going to be like the big reason people would use it. JavaScript front ends probably would be. And so I kept working on other use cases that I thought would bridge the WordPress world with the GraphQL world for a larger audience. And then in, what was it, I don't even remember time in the last few years. A couple years ago, I got picked up by Gatsby. Gatsby reached out, Gatsby, which is a JavaScript framework for building blazing fast React apps. They reached out to me and said, hey, we really like this project. We have a lot of audience that wants to use WordPress as a CMS and Gatsby as the front end. You want to work on this full time? So I joined them for, about a year and a half. Then some priorities changed there. And then, so now I'm at WP Engine, which is a WordPress host, and they're employing me to continue the project.
Oh, wow. So you get to work full-time on the project at WP Engine.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really cool.
And I was pretty much full-time on it at Gatsby as well. There's some like Gatsby plugins and stuff I was working on as well, but it was all focused around bridging headless WordPress with Gatsby.
Sure. That's awesome.
Incredible.
Well, cool. So I know at one point, and it's been a minute since I touched WordPress, there is a REST API out of the box for WordPress, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any intention by WordPress to also include maybe this as a standard implementation?
Yeah, there hasn't been, not at least including me, there hasn't been any official conversation about that.
Okay.
There has been unofficial conversations about it with
Sure.
and so it's interesting. There's a lot of value that GraphQL brings to especially developers, and it would be cool to have it in WordPress core, because WordPress core as of like this week is 43. WordPress is 43% of the web right now, so it's everywhere. So having access to this technology everywhere would be nice. On the flip side, when something is merged into WordPress core, because it impacts 43% of the web, things don't change often. And so, like, for example, the REST API was merged in, I think it was the winter of 2016, if my timeline is correct. It was either end of 2015 or end of 2016. I can't remember. There's still bugs in that have not been addressed 5 years later, because users have gotten used to the bug as a feature, right? And if you change it, it could break their their application that's using it. So that's one argument is like, okay, whatever makes it into core stays, right? It's like you've kind of agreed that this is perfect, right? And
But
we're
WordPress
keeping
isn't
it as a
versioned,
plugin. WordPress is versioned, but there's this in the WordPress community is like you could update from WordPress 1.0, which is 15 years old, to WordPress 5.8, which is right now,
Yeah.
and your site would still work. So there's
Okay.
a very strong commitment to backward compatibility. So which does lead to, in often cases, it leads to poor developer experience because there's a lot of old stuff in there. But it leads to great user experience, right? I could go to a site that I created for a friend in 2008 and update it today, and there's a very good chance it will still work. And so for users, it's an awesome experience. For developers, it's challenging sometimes, right? And so yeah, WP GraphQL being a plugin allows us to iterate and make breaking changes and version it in a way that you can opt into the version that works for your project.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Builder.io, visually building the web. Builder.io has one of the most powerful visual editors in the industry. Unlike other tools, Builder actually produces the code for you. You don't have to completely switch out your framework either, just use one of the handy SDKs that are available. There's no limits to what you can build. Instead of limiting your marketing team, start to optimize and let them do the work. This will allow your web developers to get back to the hard work that it takes for other components, allowing your team to do A/B testing and personalization. Stop worrying about bugs in production. Just use the site as it is, then you can analyze and start converting all of your customers with Builder's built-in heat maps. Stop limiting your growth with developers' long lead times. Start building, optimizing, analyzing, and start growing faster. Don't take my word for it. You can sign up for free today and start building the web visually with Builder.io.
One other thing is that GraphQL is a specification used by many systems, right? It's not like it's similar to JSON, right? JSON is a specification for a data type, and it can be used everywhere, right? And GraphQL is similar; it's more complex than JSON, but it can be used anywhere. So, like GitHub has a GraphQL API, Yelp has a GraphQL API, Facebook has, all these systems have GraphQL APIs, and we can use the same tools with all of them. The GraphQL specification, though, updates over time. And if WordPress Core 2 were to implement GraphQL today and the GraphQL specification updated tomorrow, then 43% of the web would be using an outdated version of GraphQL. Of course, you could potentially add two versions, like GraphQL 1, GraphQL 2, or something like that. But then you're just stacking on technical debt as well. So there's conversations like that would have to be considered deeply, I think, before putting it out to 43% of the web was decided.
Yeah.
All right, cool. That's really awesome. I know Brittany hasn't worked a lot with WordPress. I used to. It was probably my first thing out of college. Essentially, like probably more than those 43%, probably 80% of developers that worked on that. I think there's always a big debate, and there's been some heated conversations about monolithic versus Jamstack and all of that fun stuff. But there's also kind of this methodology these days that you can spin up a WordPress website and use it as a headless CMS. And there's a lot of people doing that now. We talked a bit about it, and I'll put a link out on the podcast with Jason back in episode 11 of this season. So check that out. But I think what I'd like to do now is kind of transition. This part might be a little more difficult if you're listening on audio, but we'll try to kind of work through this. But Jason's going to show off kind of some of the ins and outs of WP GraphQL, and we'll take a look at how you can actually use it as a headless CMS essentially.
Yeah. So I've got my screen shared here, and basically what we're looking at here is just a regular old WordPress site. I just imported some dummy content here, so we can click around. This is just normal WordPress rendered by PHP, so I can click links like click an author, and then we can see posts authored by this author. You know, we can
Cool.
click recent posts. We can navigate. So just a normal WordPress site. If we want to
kill that download bar,
yeah.
maybe we'll steal a little more of the screen.
Oh
On
yeah,
the bottom of the browser.
There we go.
Sorry.
Sure.
Cool. Perfect.
Yeah, so we can. This is just normal WordPress, nothing headless, no GraphQL happening at all yet. I'm going to log into the dashboard here. So this is the WordPress dashboard. This is very vanilla install. There's 0 plugins activated yet. So if you want to get started with WP GraphQL, you can log into your WordPress install. You can click this Add New button and search GraphQL, and you'll find this elephant, the GraphQL elephant, as I like to call it. I've already installed that. So if you haven't installed it, there would be an install button. For me, it's an activate button, so I can activate that. And
I love that it's an elephant.
when that's I was just a play on words, is why I decided. I was like, ooh, GraphQL elephant, that sounds cool.
That does sound
then,
cool. I'm an Alabama fan, so I like elephants.
Nice. Someone pointed out like a couple years later, they're like, oh, I get why you did it, because PHP's logo is an elephant. And I was like, oh, I didn't do that on purpose, but makes sense.
Does make sense.
Yes, I
I'm
did.
glad. Yeah, so that was but yeah, so when you activate it, what'll happen is you get this GraphQL tab here on the admin, and you also get a button here. And then this interface that I just opened is called GraphiQL. So GraphQL, but with an I up here. And it's an IDE for interacting with your GraphQL schema. So when you activate the plugin, what happens, you get this view, but we can also go in our browser to your site /GraphQL, and you'll have a GraphQL endpoint. So we'll see here that some JSON is being returned to us instead of a HTML page. And so we'll be able to interact with this endpoint using this IDE. And so what happens, WP GraphQL reads the underlying registries that WordPress has to define what types of content can be managed. So when WordPress, when you're using vanilla WordPress, you have different types of content. You have blog posts, you have media, right, like images and videos. You have pages, you have comments, you have themes, you have plugins, you have users, and then you have settings, right? So that's like, you get that out of the box with any WordPress install. And then obviously you can install plugins that modify the behavior. So out of the box, what WP GraphQL does, it reads all of this type of content and it puts it into a GraphQL schema, which allows you to ask for whatever data you want in response. So what I can do that using GraphiQL, I can click buttons in here to explore the schema. So there's queries and mutations. Queries allow us to ask for data, and mutations allow us to send data back to WordPress. And so I can explore this by clicking in, and then I can scroll down and read things. So we can see that there's settings. Like I mentioned, we can get settings. We can get categories, which like would be post categories. We can get comments. We can get all sorts of stuff. If you know what you're looking for, you can also type in here like post and see all the different ways we can interact with posts.
So it tells you everything that's available at that endpoint.
Yep. And so there's a lot of stuff going on here. My favorite way to do this, since I'm familiar with it, is just start typing over here. So like a common use case in WordPress would be to get a list of posts. So we can just start typing and it'll give us hints. It'll say, this is what's available based on what you're typing. And so I can query for the nodes. Each post object would be considered a node in WP GraphQL. And then we can start asking for fields of each post node. So things like an ID and a title and the date. And then we can execute by clicking this play button. And then in response, we get actual JSON payload that matches the shape of our request. So a GraphQL query, as you can see, it looks similar to JSON. It's like the keys without the values, and then the response is actual JSON keys and values. And so we can specify what we want from the system and get a payload that matches that. So over time, our manager might say, hey, in addition to the ID, the title, and date, we also need the author, right? And so what we can do, you can come back later to the query and say, oh, I want the author. And on the author is a node by itself as well. And the author node would have its own properties like a name and maybe like an avatar, which might have URL, right? So I can execute this, and in one request, I can get multiple resources. Where in a RESTful API, I would have to get the post. The payload would return an ID to the author, and then I would have to do a round trip to get the author. And at least in the WordPress REST API, you would also have another endpoint to get the avatar for that author. So we're dealing with three resources here: post, author, and the avatar of the author. So GraphQL lets you be very explicit and say, hey, my application needs these exact fields. I don't want anything else.
That's all.
And so you get to specify what you need. And so we can do this with any type of content in WordPress, right? We can start with users and get users directly. Oops. We can get their name, and we can go the reverse way. Like I could get posts that the user has authored, right? So we could do kind of the inverse of what we just did.
The other thing I really like, for instance, on our site, we have like our top 3 blogs, our latest 3 blogs, our latest 3 whatever, and you can string all of that together in GraphQL, right?
Yep. Yeah. So you can chain data.
One call,
follow.
so you don't have to have like 4 calls going back.
Yeah, that's another thing too. I can enter the root of the query multiple times, so I could. I got my caps lock on. So I could ask for posts directly from the root of the query and users at the same time. Right, so I can get my posts and my users. So I got 2 different lists of data in one network request, which is really cool. So there's some really cool stuff you can do with this. And so some other features of like the GraphQL query language that I think are really good for headless WordPress or like headless development these days is a concept called fragments. And what fragments are, so if I take a query like I just did, in like kind of the componentized architecture of today, like where everybody's using React or Vue or something like that, the common pattern is you build components that handle a specific need, right? Like, so if we were looking at, let me go. So I have some history here. I'll go back. Let's say we're doing something simple like this. We had a list of posts, and for each post we needed to render the title and the date, right? What we would probably do in our component architecture is have 2 components: a post list component and a post component, right? So you'd have one component that is responsible for getting a list, and one component that's responsible for rendering the individual thing. So what we can do in GraphQL is something called fragments. And so we can say fragment, and we can call this anything we want. We can say like post data, like this doesn't matter. We can call it anything. And then we say on post. So anytime we get to this type of data in the graph, we can specify the fields we want. So we can say, I want the ID, the title, and the date. And then what we can do is replace it up here. And then we can execute, and we're still getting the same data. What we can do though is couple this fragment with our component that renders the HTML for that data. So in your application,
you just spread that back in. Yeah.
Yep. So you would have a post list component, for example, that would have this query, and you'd import your post component to that and the fragment for the post,
Mhm.
right? And so yeah, as you grow, as your application grows, the data dependency is right there with the markup that you're outputting. So your boss comes back to you a month later and says, hey, you know what? We actually need to output, I don't know, like the GMT date, right? Which is, so we could say, okay, we need to go get that now instead of whatever it is. And so you just add that to the one component, and then you update your markup, and then it works, right? You don't have to
And
do this
then
whole like, I got to find out where we're fetching the data, and then I got to go over here and transform it, and then I got to go here, and then it's
no,
just
you just got to
update
worry about how to
fragment.
format it on the front end.
Yeah. That's for sure too. And there's some of those things though. We have. Let me switch over. So I'll show some of that as well in a second. I'm going to activate. So the GraphQL we're looking at now ships with WP GraphQL today. I am working on a new version of GraphQL, so you can get it. It's on GitHub under WP GraphQL.
Is GraphiQL something that you created?
GraphQL
And
2. No.
okay.
I wish. I just use it.
Is
So
that from
GraphiQL,
Facebook?
Facebook open sourced it, and it's like a React component. It's now part of the actual GraphQL foundation, which
Okay.
is separate from Facebook now. But yeah, so they open source it. I use it. I'm working on a new version of the WordPress specific version, so it's open source as well. You can go download it. It'll ship with WP GraphQL in the future, but I'll activate that to show some other cool features real quick. So if you activate that, same thing. It's just a little bit newer interface. So we still have GraphiQL here, but we have some additional features. Like I can switch between executing as a logged in user or a public user, because WordPress has some data that is not visible to public users. And so I would kind of want to show some of that stuff. So we can say, like, there's a query in here called viewer. So we can get information about who the current viewer is. And so if I execute this right now, I'm executing as a public user, it's going to say nobody. I don't know who you are. If I click this button, we can see it's using whoever I'm logged in as here. It's going to use my identity. So now I can execute and it says, oh, I know who you are, right? So we can do some very dynamic stuff here, right? Like WooCommerce is a big e-commerce platform for WordPress. There's a GraphQL extension for that, right? So you can get your product information, which is generally public to anybody, but then you can also get your cart information, right? Like what items are in your cart and how to calculate taxes for your zip code or whatever it might be. So stuff that's unique to you, you can interact with. If we don't know who you are, you might not get the data. If we know who you are, you might get the data.
This sounds like a better interface to me. I'm familiar with putting headers in the bottom, those query variables where you have to put in the header for the stuff you need, and that's how you would typically do that in the cases that I've used. And that's nice to have that visual there that just kind of logs you in, and then it allows you to access that.
Yeah, and behind the scenes, that is what is happening. It still is, like, over the network, we still have to send headers to identify who we are. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this is just trying to make it easier for you to get up and running. There's other cool stuff we can do. So fragments is a really cool thing. There's another concept called variables. So we can say, like, we'll say query, and we can name our queries. So we can say, like, get posts, and we can say we can define a variable. So variable in GraphQL starts with a $, and you can name it anything you want. And then you have to say what type of data it's going to be. So we'll say this is going to be an integer. And then we can write our query and say posts first. And we're going to use a variable value for this. And then we can ask for what we need to ask for, like the ID and the title. And now we have this first variable here. So whatever value I put in here, like 2, will affect this query. So we're going to have 2 posts returned, or 1 post returned, or 10 posts returned. So what this allows me to do is write a query that my component can use, but allow users to submit, interactive elements. Like, I don't know, if you were on a product page and you wanted to see 10, products per page, or 20 or whatever, the user can interact with it and it can affect the outcome of the query, right? So
is there
you
a
can,
idea of pagination with this setup as well?
yeah, yep,
Cool.
yeah. So you can paginate for sure. So there's a concept in, so one thing to note about GraphQL in general, before I get into the pagination, GraphQL, the technology by itself, does not enforce any schema design decisions. You can have a schema that is as simple as one field, hello, that returns a string world, right? And that could be your entire GraphQL API. And it can also get very complex. When it comes to things like pagination, GraphQL itself doesn't do anything for you to paginate. But in the GraphQL community, there's a specification called the relay specification, which also came from Facebook. And it's a set of conventions for how they think a schema should be designed to accomplish common needs, right? And pagination is one of those needs.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're paginating data, some things you need to know about the data would be, is there more data, right? Am I at the end of the list, or is there more data? If there is more data, how can I get to it, right? And so in here, there's a concept called edges. And this is a concept that comes from the graph, or from the relay spec. And so instead of querying for nodes directly, we can query for edges. And what edges do is it gives us some contextual data about between the query and the node itself. And what we can do is ask for a thing called a cursor.
And for anyone on audio too, he switched from using nodes to a singular node now. So edges in the node.
Oh, sure. And so we can ask for what's called a cursor. And this is a reference for where in the list of data that specific node is. And then what we can also ask for is something called page info. And we can ask, does this query have a next page? So there's a field called has next page. That'll either say true or false. And then we can either ask for the cursor at this point, or we can also ask for what's called the end cursor here. If I execute this, it's going to say has next page is true. And so I can ask for the next page. I say, okay, I asked for 10 items. The server says there's more than 10. We can verify this also by, I'm going to open the post view here. We can see there are 39 posts altogether. 37 of them are published. So if we're asking for 10 items, we'll get 4 pages, right? So what we can do, we can change our query to have an after variable. And this will be a string. And we will change it in here too. We'll say after. So what we're going to do, if we query for 10 items, that'll be our first page. And we can say after null. So there, we're not going to say after anything. So if I query this will be page 1. And then I can use this cursor, the end cursor. I can either take it from here or I can take it from the edge. And I can put it, oh, I did not copy it. So if I copy that cursor and execute again, I'll get the next set of results. And this would be very similar to saying like page 2 right here. So I'll get the next set of results, and we can continue until has next page returns false. So one more, and we'll be at the end of the list. So now has next page is false, and we have like whatever the last 7 items. So now I know you reached the end of the list. So you can use that for infinite scroll, or like Slack. When you're scrolling through Slack, every time you scroll, it says, "Hey, is there more messages?" and it loads them. Is there more messages? And it loads them. Right? You can build a UI like that. I have a blog post where I go in depth on pagination and I show how to do it with like next and previous buttons as well. There's
we'll add it to the notes. Cool.
Oh yeah, sure. So it's like wpgraphql.com and maybe, yeah, here we go. Pagination. There we go. Pagination. Yeah, there we go. Oh, did I not click it? I don't know how to use a computer. There we go. So a blog post called Forward and Backward Pagination with WP GraphQL. And there's like examples in here, and I think there's a code sandbox somewhere in here if it loads. Yeah. Here we go. Yeah, so it shows, it's like an actual UI that shows it. Looks like it's taking a minute to load, but yeah, so that's so we have pagination, we have variables. There's another really cool thing that I love called aliases. So if you had like a component and you said, hey, we don't want this thing to be called title, we want it to be called name, right? I can, in my query, I can say, I want the title, but can you give it to be called name? And so I say, give it to me called name. And in response, it comes back to me called name. So I can do some cool stuff like that. I can also do, you mentioned formatting. Not all fields support this at the moment, but it's possible to. So we can pass arguments to individual fields. So I can say like, I want the content to be rendered, which would be like in WordPress, you have raw content, which is like whatever the user inputs. And then you have rendered content, which takes what they input and makes sure it's HTML, right? So I can execute this and I'll get the rendered HTML, or I can execute raw, which will give me something else sometimes. Sometimes it looks the same. But like here's a good example. There's WordPress has a concept called shortcodes. I can also query this side by side. So we can say with an alias, I can say rendered, and just so we can see it side by side, and I can say rendered. So we'll see here. This is something that's used behind the scenes in WordPress, but that doesn't make sense. Like on the front end, like nobody gets value out of this, right? And so behind the scenes, we have like that video one. Oh, it didn't work here. Tisk.
Oh, it gives you the HTML.
Yeah.
But it didn't render out. I see.
Yeah, that was that might be a bug. But anyway, you can see there's differences in the output. Here's a better example.
You could start to like write your own functions around these as well. So take the shortcodes and in React now stick a component in there type of thing.
Yep, you could. Here's a better example. Here was a raw YouTube link that was in the raw content, but in the rendered content, it's the actual full YouTube iframe. Right.
Nice.
Ah, nice.
So there's stuff like that. You could do this with things like dates. Like that's when you mentioned it. We could have different formats for dates. We don't at the moment, but we could, and very likely will at some point.
I'm using
so
where clause, I think, on the Spelt Siren site to like order by date.
Yeah, so we can do that as well. So we can say where we can do whatever. We can say like author in, and we can pass it like a list of IDs. I'm gonna get rid of the content just because it's long, but we can then I'll query for some authors just so we can see. So I can filter. Let's see, what is it? Author. Let me do it without it so we can get. Okay, so my author's ID is 3. So when I did it by author 1, it didn't work because I don't have an author 1. I do have an author 3 though. So I can query by author 3, and we can see I'm going to get any articles written by author 3, which let's see who that is. We have Chris Ames. He's authored 3 articles. We can verify this, right? We can go to the front end or whatever, and just to make sure we're getting the right data, right? So we can say, here's Chris Ames. We can look at his archive page here. Oh, that actually went to his website. I didn't want that. Let's see. I thought it would have gone to, let's see.
But that would allow
All
you
these
to
are
get
external
like
links.
all the posts by Chris Ames. So you could then have
Yeah,
like
exactly.
another page that would list out all his posts.
Yeah, so
at the end of the
what is
day,
it? Anyway.
you're basically taking a lot of I don't know if you're running an Apollo client or what's on top of this, but you're essentially
There we go.
taking whatever graph query language and breaking that down to a SQL statement, I assume, since that's what's under the hood on WordPress.
Yep. Yeah, so yeah, it goes from GraphQL. WordPress has internal mechanisms for querying SQL. Like there's a series of classes called WP Query, WP User Query, WP Tax Query. So it uses all of those things, and the WordPress ecosystem hooks into those things and does things like there's cache plugins, for example, that will hook into those mechanisms. So you can install something like a Redis cache mechanism that will cache objects from WordPress into Redis. And that works with regular WordPress, but that will also work here. And so, so you can take advantage of existing WordPress ecosystem things. There's some other cool things, like there's plugins out there where you can, without writing code, you can define custom post types in WordPress. There's popular plugins like there's one called Custom Post Type UI that does this, and then there's plugins like Advanced Custom Fields that are popular that allow you to create fields in WordPress. I'm going to demo one from my employer WP Engine. It's called Atlas Content Modeler, and so what this allows us to do is, without writing any code, we can create new models or new data types in WordPress. So let's say we were like cars, for example, would maybe be a good one. So we give it a single name and a plural name, and then we can define whether it's public. We can choose like an icon that we want. I don't know if there's a car icon. My guess is there's probably not. Oh, there is. Sweet. So we can have cars, and we can say like a collection of cars or whatever. So we can create
a table within SQL then.
It's not. It's using WordPress convention, so it's using what's called post type. So it's a same table that any type of post would be stored in.
Gotcha.
But we could give it different fields, right? Like name, or like I don't know, what's a good one? Make or whatever, or model.
Yeah, make model.
We'll go model. There we go. So we could create that. We could add another field. You said color. I don't know if we have a color picker in here yet, but so we'll just do a string, color of. We'll just start there. We'll say make and model. So what you can see though, like I just created this. I didn't write any code, and already I have the cars showing up here, right? I didn't have to write PHP, right? So if I'm a full-on JavaScript developer, for example, I could be pretty successful without writing PHP here. So I can now, I can go model my data, and then I can go publish some data. So I can come in here and I can say, we have like what's a model? So I don't know. We'll say like model I. There we go, and we'll say white. Right. So then I can publish this content, and then. What's cool, if I'm in Content Modeler here, I can actually click Open in GraphiQL here, and we can see it's going to generate a query. If I didn't break this, there we go. So it's going to tell me like, oh, here's how you can query this in GraphiQL. There's also this UI. I totally skipped this. There's this UI over here too, called the Query Composer. That allows us to create queries by UI. So like I can. Click.
I have to use that version for every GraphQL thing I've ever done because I can never remember it all.
It's nice.
So you can navigate the graph and then click the fields you want. I sometimes forget that's there because I just like to type more. But so it'll generate a query for you here, right? And it uses the fragments, and so I can go take this, put it in my React component or my Vue component or whatever it might be. And so, without writing a line of PHP, I just generated a new model or type of content in WordPress. I published it, and now I'm able to get it out of my application, right? So, and then you could also mutate from GraphQL too, which I mentioned, but. So we can say
is
like
there an idea
mutation.
behind like published and unpublished content?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So
You
let's.
don't have to show it. I was just kind of curious as I was thinking through.
I
Like,
will.
you
I
got
will. I
roles
will.
and published and unpublished, and
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
we could get into like every aspect, but I think this is a really good overview to get people kind of excited about like the capability that WP GraphQL has. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit up on time for the
Okay. Sure.
pod. I know Jason would be more than happy to show like people this stuff
Yeah.
all day long. I think, do you have a YouTube channel where you show a lot of this off as well?
Not as much as I should, but yeah, you can. WP GraphQL is my YouTube channel. You can also. I have videos on WordPress.tv as well, like conference talks and whatnot.
Cool. I'll put that up
I'll,
on our blog post too.
And then WP Engine also has a DevRel channel. If you go to developers.wpengine.com, we've got a podcast that talks a lot about headless WordPress. So we've got a podcast, we got some videos, we got tutorials and whatnot.
Fantastic. We'll throw all those in the show notes, and that will help people know where to go and get started.
Cool. Well, we're going to shift gears a little bit here and jump over to our perfect picks. And I've completely lost where my browser window is for our perfect picks. There it is. Okay. So our first perfect pick is actually one from Jason. Jason, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, so I picked Local by Flywheel. So you could actually find it at localwp.com as well. And so Local is a developer tool that it's a desktop application you install, and it allows you to spin up WordPress environments with a click of a button. It'll set up the database. It'll set up everything you need to start running WordPress. Takes probably 30 seconds to have a WordPress install up and running. I use it every single day.
Yeah, it's really incredible. When we're kind of going through the phase of having WordPress as coding cats at full site, we were using it quite a bit. So, or at least I was. It was pretty cool. Brittany, your first pick.
Yeah, my first pick is e-commerce on the Jamstack with Snipcart, Next.js, and WordPress, which is a mouthful. But if you do not know who Colby Fayok is, you may recognize him a little bit better as Space Jelly, which I have his sticker right. I can't figure out which way to go right there. And he's the little Space Jelly octopus. It's really cool. He is a great guy and a great teacher, and he works a lot with headless WordPress, and this will get you set up with a cart, like an e-commerce store that you can just ship and start selling stickers, Space Jelly stickers. And it's on Level Up Tutorials, which is also a fantastic platform. So
I probably shouldn't have clicked that button, but I saw a WP GraphQL section in there, so good call.
There you go. See.
Yeah.
And then Brittany's fun pick.
Yes, my fun pick is Procreate. I have been really diving in the last few days, doing some YouTube tutorials on it just to get the feel. Every time you get into a new application, it's kind of overwhelming with how many choices there are, and Procreate is not an exception to that. It's very in-depth. There's a lot to look at and see, and so I like to have those video tutorials to kind of show me where things are. And I've been doing some of the regular tutorials, and yesterday I did my first animated one and I finished it, and we're showing it on screen. It's an animated snow globe. There's snow falling onto a snowman and some trees there. It's really fun to just play with and relax.
That's cool. I have to ask, did you make the entire snow globe and everything?
I drew everything.
Wow, that's really incredible. That's awesome.
But Procreate gives you a lot of helpers, like the circles and stuff. You can you draw the circle and then you hold it and it will automatically generate the right circle. And so
correct me on this. Does Procreate do vectors or no?
Not that I've seen yet.
Okay.
I mean, you can make things that look like vector artwork, but it's not like an SVG.
Okay. I always struggled through all of those pieces because I love my SVGs. So.
Yeah, I know. I do too, and that's why I like Figma a lot, but I don't think it does SVG files.
Cool. Awesome. My first pick, totally unrelated, but I'm so excited because I still am kind of occasionally diving back into Flutter and seeing what's happening. And I saw this Flutter flow come up, and as you know, I started at Builder, so I keep checking out all these like visual editors now. And this is one for Flutter that's come out. It's really neat. You can drag all these kind of different components into it and build an entire Flutter app, basically no code.
Oh, so it's a low-code tool for Flutter.
Yeah, it's
cool.
really, really impressive.
Or no code, I guess.
And the tie-in with Firebase was spot on. So I was shocked. Like we could have our whole site up and running very quickly on it. Pretty cool. My second pick, which Brittany actually mentioned some post. I don't even remember what it was.
Yeah, have I picked this before? I swear I had to have picked this.
You might have.
This podcast is so good. I won't ruin it.
I had no idea about it, honestly. And I think you posted about, maybe it was the Fauna piece. You said something like, we just did the Fauna podcast, and then you came back to it and we're like, it's popping up everywhere now.
Yep.
And I started like, wow, there's a lot out here. And so I started diving back through the episodes. Go check them out.
Just to listen. And they are so hilarious. I mean, working at Netlify must be just like meme central because they are the funniest people on the planet.
I tell you what, when Phil and like Cassie get going on there, they're just ridiculous. So it's a great podcast. We're gonna have to up our game with like dad jokes or something. I don't know.
That might turn viewers away.
I'm too serious on this. We need more laughs.
Yeah, we gotta relax. Chill out.
Well, Jason, I really appreciate your time. I think this is a really cool tool. I think without it, I don't know if I'd ever touch WordPress again. So honestly, you've opened up this whole new like realm of possibilities for people.
Seriously.